Welcome, everyone, to concurrent session A. My name is Cambria Kaltwasser, and if you and I haven't met, then sometimes I'm seen around here, my alma mater, Princeton Seminary, mostly in connection with the Barth Translation Seminar. So um, Today I have the wonderful task of introducing our two speakers for this session. So we're going to hear their papers one after the other, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So our first speaker is Dr. Hank Spaulding, who many of you will know because he has been the editor of the publication by the Center for Barth Studies, God Here and Now, that most of us receive in our inbox quite often. So that's his claim to fame among here, but he is the author of several books, including two books that you can find out there if you're interested: The Just and Loving Gaze of God with Us and Iconoclastic Sex. Two books. You can see them both out there. And now he's about to take a job at Indiana Wesleyan Seminary. Right? Yes. So without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Spaulding.
I feel like it's obligatory at this point just to acknowledge how cool it is to stand in this pulpit. So this will probably be like the peak of my academic career, presenting at a Barth conference, standing in Barth's pulpit on incarceration. So this paper arises from some experiences I have teaching students who are experiencing incarceration. There's one particular student whose permission I got to share this little tidbit about them was working on an assignment for my introduction to ethics class. And the purpose of the assignment was to identify a time when you were facing a moral problem and what are the resources that you use to, solve that moral problem. And this student was a former serviceman. He came back from deployment overseas, but was struggling with PTSD. And so he was having a hard time finding work. And so he shared his ethical dilemma was he was facing eviction with his pregnant girlfriend at the time. And the only options that were available to him were ones that involved him to do illegal activities. And so he was faced with a broken promise that he made to his wife. He made her two promises, or girlfriend. He made her two promises. One, he would never leave her to raise their child alone, and he would never lead them to a place where they had to live on the streets. And in his paper, as he's kind of introducing this moral problem, which is the event that led to his incarceration, he asked this question that's haunted me ever since. And he says, how can I make good choices when I've only ever been given bad ones to make? And I think that is a question that haunts all moral thinking, haunts Christian ethics, haunts Christian theology. The way in which we isolate certain decisions and understand our freedom before God and one another as dislocated events sequentially happening in time. And the way that certain actions in our world, especially in where there's carceral theology at play, this theology of incarceration, which I'll unpack in this paper, how these actions carry weight on a person. So this paper wants to take that question seriously, not as a failure of this student, but as really a theological indictment on the carceral logic that's at the heart of that question. I offer instead Karl Barth's Christology, which is not just a different ethic, but a different moral ontology, which I believe is the basis of the moral teachings of the church dogmatics. And it's one not grounded in the sovereign will, but it is in the reconciling act of Christ. And so in the cross, and I just really need to footnote everything that Sarah Job said this morning as she was speaking. I was like, that's exactly what I want to say. So if you hear her there, know that that's not my intention, but I'm glad that she has a great theology there as well. But in the cross, I believe that Barth reveals a loophole of retreat, to borrow a phrase from Harriet Jacobs, from the crushing logic of moral heroism, and a retreat from the demand to be right into a reality shaped by grace, solidarity, and human frailty. So here ethics begins not with a decision, but with being, with one participation in God, who is the judge, judged in our place, against every system that presumes to divide righteous from the condemned. And so in this paper, I'm going to look at Barth's theology of reconciliation for Christian ethics and how it challenges carceral logic. So to begin, I want to start by unpacking what this carceral logic is. The weight of my students' question, I believe, comes from how American evangelicalism, and through its long history, has sacralized retribution by fusing theology with punitive politics. Evangelicals, through its long history of individuals like Charles Finney and others, actively legitimize mass incarceration by treating crime as sin and punishment as redemption. The worst possible redemptive suffering is on display in this theology, and it leads to a moral disciplining through carcerality and disproportionately targeting Black and Brown communities. And so ultimately, I think that I borrow this phrase from Byron White, who presented a wonderful paper at the AAR, that ultimately the logic of incarceration is a white supremacist realized eschatology. See, Doug Campbell, I believe this morning was right about this law and gospel distinction that's on play and how it informs public discourse around incarceration. But again, the question posed by my student is a moral one. How can I make good choices when I've only ever been given bad ones to make? Echoing Judith Butler's rearticulation of Theodore Adorno's dilemma, how does one lead a good life and a bad life? I believe Butler's rephrasing here questions and names a biopolitical reality, which by I mean a structuring structure at the heart of my student's moral impasse. His question, how can I make a good choice and I've been given only bad ones, emerges not from a failure of character, but from a social order in which some lives are structurally abandoned before any decision is made. In Butler's framework, regimes of power determine which lives are grievable, lives worth mourning, protecting, or preserving, and those that are shaped by incarceration, PTSD, poverty, and systemic neglect, already coded as ungrievable. These are already marked as well, not as a life meant to flourish. Biopolitically, this means that my student is governed not through care, but through containment, surveillance, and criminalization. The moral significance of this cannot be overstated. A biopolitical order that renders certain lives disposable and presents a challenge to their agency and the ethical intelligibility by which they know themselves is a challenge that we must take seriously. The very condition of my student's life, what counts as good, what choices are visible, what outcomes are possible, are structured by a world that has already decided against him. Thus, when he has to make good choices in the midst of bad options, he is given a voice to the ethical distortion produced by a political theology that has baptized his abandonment as moral order. In this context, the question is not whether individuals can choose rightly, but whether the moral imagination has room for those whose lives are excluded from the categories of protection and grace. This is the hidden violence of what I term carceral theology. Not merely that it supports prisons, but that it forms Christians to believe that punishment is a form of moral clarity, and even broader than Christians, I think, just culture in general. In this light, my students' question is not a failure, again, but a system that makes moral formation impossible unless one consents to their own subjection. And so now I turn to looking at Karl Barth and the moral system of reconciliation. Now, the carceral theology at work in this paper has a deeper symptom and a distortion in Christian ethics, which we don't talk about very often, called a system of goodness. Systems are not simply misapplication of moral standards or a failure to balance justice with mercy. They are fatal mistakes of imagining that goodness is something one possesses by standing apart from and, in fact, over and against others who are deemed as bad. The problem with systems of goodness is not merely their exclusivity, but their internal contradiction. As James Allison and others, oh, my thing just decided to reload. Okay. That's terrifying. Okay, there we go. As James Allison and others argue, any goodness that is predicated on being not like the bad inevitably becomes dependent on that badness for its coherence. In other words, my goodness in such a system is always over and against someone else's badness, kind of like a measuring stick. Thus, even in the appearance of righteousness, we become complicit in the mechanism of exclusion. Moral frameworks then deform the possibility of both community and our own self understanding. Communities bound to systems of goodness require victims to maintain their cohesion, and someone must always be cast out in order for the group to feel secure in its moral identity and righteousness. Likewise, individuals are driven by a compulsion to appear good, not because they are responding to grace, but because they fear an exclusion. The tragic result is goodness becomes not a form of love, but a form of control, a desperate attempt to avoid shame by protecting it elsewhere. And so, if this is true of evangelical law and order theology or carceral goodness in general, then I think that Barth's Christology helps us deconstruct the foundation of that logic. In Barth's doctrine of reconciliation, the crucified Christ is not merely with the guilty, but identifies as the condemned, as we learned from Sarah Job this morning. In so doing, Christ exposes and overthrows the system of moral differentiation that undergirds both punitive religion and mass incarceration. For Barth, Christ's being made sin is not metaphorical or symbolic. It's the theological core of God's self-identification with the ones made outcast by human moral systems. The cross does not confirm moral categories, it collapses them. And so, in light of the comments made by Dr. Job this morning, I wanted to add my own thoughts and images about the judge judged in our place, specifically one from John 18, where Jesus is before Pilate. Here, Jesus, as the judge, is judged in our place, and I think that takes a different meaning when considered Barth's theology when considered in light of this image. The theological imagery of Barth begs this comparison. Pilate, in his mistaken power, stands to judge the judge of the universe, and Pilate has power, and the crowd already condemns Jesus with incarceration, and Pilate merely affirms that. But if Jesus is the the judge in the cosmic salvific sense, then Jesus is also the judge here condemned by Pilate. The judge chooses to stand in solidarity with the condemned who will be crucified along with him. And he chooses to do that rather than identify with the judge of this world, namely Pilate. And so inside of the triune economy, God puts skin in this game as a kind of apology for the way the world has collapsed into a system of goodness. And so, in light of the system of goodness that this world is, it's not only flawed, but it is judged and unmasked in this moment. Barth insists that our justifying distinctions between sinner and saint, between criminal and law-abiding, are rendered void. All are simul justus et peccator. God's righteousness does not require punishment in the carceral category to be realized in the human sense, but mercy. It's not a reward, but grace, not desert, but forgiveness. The theological claim disarms any attempt to claim goodness as a possession for oneself and thereby renders invalid the moral imagination that hinges on identifying and disciplining a bad group in order to preserve our goodness. So Barth's incarnational logic compels his readers to imagine justice not as the division between innocent and guilty, but shared guilt in need of reconciliation. One should draw a connection between election here and Barth and reconciliation in Barth. It is not the punishment of the guilty or innocent one taking on guilt, as it would be a penal substitutionary atonement category, but rather the elect one who is rejecting rejectedness, reconciling so as to eliminate God forsakenness in this moment. And this happens in Christ's own person. Paul's theological logic that in Christ God reconciles us to himself undoes this partial imagination. And so punishment is not the means of rightness, but of grace. And so ultimately, this idea of punishment thus has to be undone. And so for Christian ethics, the jarring Christological reversal in Barth's doctrine of reconciliation must not go unnoticed. Jesus is both the judge and the one who is judged. Barth offers not simply a reversal of roles, but an apocalyptic disruption of moral categories. The cross is not God's act of grace, as it is God's exposure of evil masquerading as goodness. It must never escape the moral imagination that when God becomes human, humanity condemns God as a criminal. I think that's a really important point to think through when considering this logic, that God as human is criminal. The value of Barth's moral ontology lies in the fact that he not only challenges what we think, but the places from which we think. It is from the place of this condemned one on the cross that ethical and theological thinking must begin. Now, this is not incidental to salvation, it's essential. In Jesus Christ, God enters as subject into the very structures, legal, moral, and religious, by which humanity secures its righteousness and is executed under it by the righteous ones. This is not a metaphor, it is the exposure of human goodness as violence. The very order that defines itself through the exclusion of the incarcerated is revealed at the cross to be an order that crucifies God. Barth's vision of reconciliation is not divine indifference to sin, but God's total solidarity with the judge. The judge is judged not to affirm carceral categories, but to undo them. The judge enacts a universal judgment not by sorting the guilty from the innocent, but by judging the very systems that presume to do so. And so now just a brief word about theological ethics beyond carceral goodness. In this light, salvation is not the improvement of a morally superior one or an appropriate punishment for those deemed sinful. It is the resurrection of the condemned. Healing does not occur through this moral distancing, but through divine implicatedness in our systems. It is not cheap grace, it is solidarity. And so, this solidarity is how humans participate ontologically in God's reconciliation work. Barth's Christology reveals not only the mercy of God, but the evil of systems of goodness in humanity. It shows that the crucifixion was not an anomaly. It was the expected outcome of a world that defines righteousness through punishment and exclusion. The question the church must answer then is not whether it stands for moral clarity, but whether it seeks the liberation of the crucified. If the cross exposes carceral goodness as moral violence, then the resurrection and the gift of the Holy Spirit opens up new ethical horizons. One is no longer shaped by exclusion, but by reconciliation. Christian ethics must be reimagined along these lines in light of the crucified and risen judge who was judged in our place. This new trajectory is not about securing moral purity, but about the moral ontology out of which moral action can occur. Barth reminds us that ethics flows not from virtue or principles, but from the event of reconciliation. The Spirit, as a result, draws humanity into the very life of Christ, where holiness is not defined by separation, but by and in communion. In this life, humans are not called to be self assured moral agents, but those who live in response to God's grace, bound to one another in healing. So, what is then the question or the answer for my student? I believe that the Spirit binds, as Barth presents, the humanity of God to the humanity of creatures, just as God's humanity is our humanity and our humanity is God's. This creates a different vision of freedom, for it is with our humanity, so it is with our freedom. God's freedom becomes our freedom, and mysteriously, our freedom becomes God's freedom. It is with this freedom, fully God and fully human, that leads to Christ's own crucifixion. That's how he chooses to exercise it. And so there's a parallel here between what Barth calls freedom and what Hortense Spillers terms the hieroglyphics of the flesh. She notes that the way that racial slavery, and we could also include to that incarceration, leaves its mark as we are socially entangled beings with one another. And it leaves its mark terribly in the situations of slavery and incarceration. But it's also a site, paradoxically, of freedom. Those marked by slavery are not merely passive beings, but active, and the flesh that they carry proleptically hopes for a vision of humanity beyond the vastitudes of Western man. In other words, it seeks to define humanity beyond the categories established for it by colonialism and all the varieties of Western imagination. God's freedom is free in just this way. God's freedom is free to be truly communal and truly to act in response as community. To be given bad choices are not the sole responsibility of the students or all who face those bad choices, but that of humanity as a whole. The moral question is not what he should do alone, but what all of us should do with him. And I'm drawing from sociologist Andrea Sangovini on this solidarity as joint action idea. The spirit engaged ethic. Did it again? Yes, so the spirit shaped ethic resists the logic of control and distance, does not resolve moral clarity through carceral violence, but it restores, inhabits, and it stays. Is not merely an expansion of inclusion or a conservative retrenchment of boundaries. It is a cruciform life that knows we belong to one another because we belong to Christ, at the boundary of what others call moral order. It seeks, I believe, this freedom of God that's realized through the Holy Spirit, as John Sobrino argues, to seek to take down the crucified from their crosses. This is the humanity of God enacted in the flesh. And the pneumatological move begins with not with even you, but even us are the recipients of God's grace. No one achieves goodness by rights or their right actions, but it is entirely a gift given by the Holy Spirit. Thus, to live under the sign of baptism is to be marked not by moral achievement, but by death and resurrection. If we are raised with Christ, we are raised together. No one is reconciled alone, and the Christian life is not is not flight toward goodness, but a spirit-led solidarity of grace. And so, lastly, returning to my students' question one last time, how can I make good choices when I've only been given bad ones? It reveals how Christian ethics has too often been shaped by a logic of carcerality or incarceration. This logic forms the righteous persons to perform harm by naming some who live as virtuous, and others who live as disposable. In contrast, Barth's doctrine of reconciliation reveals the judge of all was judged in our place, exposing the falsehood of moral superiority and grounding ethics not in goodness, but in God's grace. True holiness is not separation, but solidarity through the Spirit. He draws us into shared vulnerability, healing, and hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Dr. Samuel Lee, who is a certified biblical counselor with ACBC and a founding member of Love Biblical Counseling. He holds a PhD in chemistry, an MBA from Purdue, and an MDiv from Faith Bible Seminary. So, without further ado, here is Dr. Lee.
Hello. Have you have anybody in your family or friends in prison? You know? Yes. Right? So, like in America, in 1 hour every 400 people are in prison, right? And I'm a missionary kid. And, I started Bible counseling for the missionary children. I know they have issues and problems and challenges, right? And then suddenly, one of my best friends for 40 years went to prison. And when you go to prison, you do not go by yourself. There is a prolonged process, indictment and conviction, typically 1.5 years. And then not only you suffer, but all the family members suffers, and congregations and outside people all suffer, right? So I'm not equipped to handle this kind of crisis. And then I feel like I'm in Princeton and he's in prison, right? So I really want to know how to handle this crisis individually, and how to counsel family members, and also how to counsel him in prison. So I'd like to talk about first, there are many competing voices. The family perspective, government perspective, and congregational perspective, and also those people who are outside of church, who are looking in, and how you react, right? So first of all, I'll talk about their perspectives. And then, since I'm in the Barth Conference, I signed up and I sent my abstract. Just reading one paper by Joe, okay? And so when I typed the Google Scholar, that paper came up. So based on that, okay, Karl Barth. I read and then, write the paper. And, oh my God, I know Karl Barth. I had two encounters with Karl Barth. Okay? When I was, several years ago, I had a heart bite, right? And one of the side effects is like insomnia, right? So I asked my friend, what is the most boring theological book to read? Dogmatics. Which part? Volume 4. Okay? It's like magic. 15 minutes of reading. Boom, I'm asleep. Fall asleep. I cannot last 15 minutes, okay? Right? Better than any medicine. And then now I'm here, the Karl Barth Conference. And I pick up that book again, okay? For 5,000 pages. What's going on with it? So, but at least, I superficially read some of them. Then I want to, it's like you hit the nuggets along the way. So I'll talk about some nuggets that I got for counseling. So family members, also incarcerated, my pastor friend. Okay. So first of all, I talk about the case. So it starts from personally. He's a pastor / doctor, pastor / physician. So he's very well known among our community. He's a pillar of the community, right? And suddenly, government knocked on his door, and he was charged with Medicare fraud. And then he was tried and convicted, went to prison. But first of all, I talk about there are so many competing voices in this crisis. And then I'll talk about first, let's hear from son's anguish defense. And then this represents his wife. And wife becomes silent, but he spoke. I talked to him and he spoke. His family stands. Tom, Dr. K's son, presented a counter narrative revealing the human complexity often lost in legal proceedings. He argues that my father was trapped, and he was not what government said what he is. Government said your father is a massive mafia-style conspirator, and that he has to go to prison for 20 years. And then when he said he just did few minor offenses, but government filed them up with 57 charges. And then I went to court. 12 prosecutors came with a stacks of like and my friend was by himself with one lawyer. And then my heart sank because he didn't want to lose. Right? And his son said, it's not fair. It's not justice. And why he has to go to prison, right? And then but there is a government institutional response, right? Government says, you broke the law. You participate in Medicare fraud. So you deserve to go to prison, right? If you just let you go, then we don't set the good example, right? And then you Dr. K, you are doctor, you should know better, right? So you are highly trained. So you cannot say, I don't know. So there was a case. And then his perspective prioritizes the consistent application of law over individual circumstances, and that it just flattens the person, okay? It just label you, you are marketable, okay? So you have to go to prison. And there is a church family responses. They've known this guy for over 40 years. Right? It's not just pastor. He's the one who baptized the children, who counseled you when you went through dark times. You preach the word every week. Not only he did it as a physician, but he was their pastor. he was willing to treat you bodily or also spiritually, right? So think about their reaction. So some people are very loyal, okay? And then some follow Dr. K's son's perspective. He was trapped. And he said command is wrong. But some people believe the newspaper articles and internet, they look up, and then they believe that we're like misled by this guy. If we didn't know him, we thought we know him, but we didn't know him, right? So it was conflicting responses from the congregation. And then there's also outside judgment, okay? And then there are some skeptical people who do not trust doctors, who don't trust the religious leaders also. And this is a case of, professional got greedy and religious leader fallen from grace. Right? So, so we have to, I have to hear all these conflicting voices. And how do you process? And then Karl Barth, Volume 4, Reconciliation, must be some answers, right? So I began to read, and then I'd like to share some of the things that I gleaned out of that volume. And then there are a few things that I found useful as I counsel the family members and also congregation. Barth's theoretical framework. I think that Barth understood prison because he was a prisoner. So he was disappointed with the theologians and teachers who really, he said, really under those people, and then they succumbed to the government, okay? And they supported World War II and World War II and Hitler, right? And because of that, he spoke out. Because of that, he paid the price. He was exiled to Switzerland, and then he lost his job at university, and he paid high price. So I think Barth has something to say about the humiliation and dehumanization process by the institution, the government, right? So I think that Barth is not a theologian, but he is the, Sarah Jobs said, justice involves theologian. What's kind of a long word, but he's a criminal. He's a crook, right? So, and then as I read Barth Volume 4 with this lens, and I began to understand it because his experience informed his theology. So, first thing I learned is Christ judged. Right? So it's like CD 5, Part 1, Section 592. The judge is judged in our place. I think this is just simply a metaphorical description. But this is Barth understood Christ. He's a judge judged, not by the Father, not by God, but by the human institutions, flawed human institutions. So he paints out long passage of Jesus, willing to enter the dark as the accused, experience the machinery of state violence, and undergoes the ultimate sentence of execution. And then he said, was sought out and arrested as a malefactor, accused as a blasphemer and an agitator. So that's what Barth saw Jesus from his experience. And then Barth saw Jesus as incarcerated Christ. This represents a theological claim. crisis identification with prisoners isn't merely a historical or metaphorical. It's a present reality. Jesus is same today, yesterday, today, tomorrow. He's eternally a prisoner. And Barth came to see Christ as a present here today among us, before all our locked prison doors. So Barth, rather than locating God primarily in churches, seminaries, or respectable religious institutions, Barth finds God's presence most fully revealed in zones of social abandonment. Prisons, places of punishment, and spaces where society discards people it deems irredeemable. 3, and divine solidarity with the abandoned. So Barth theology reframes our understanding of divine solidarity, that God doesn't sympathize with human suffering from a distance. God fully inhabits the subject positions society considers. It's a quotation, God forsaken, and words hellholes, looking just like everybody else's in those hellholes. And that's what I said. And Christ doesn't visit prisoners as an outsider bringing charity. Christ is a prisoner, sharing the full experience of incarceration. So we have to frame our perspective. If Christ is present among the abandoned, then encountering the incarcerated becomes a prioritized site for Christian life and discipleship. So Barth argues that, quote, if Barth's words, salvation history happens in prison. So what it means for our churches, our seminaries? If we truly believe that God is present in our prison, the salvation history unfolds behind locked doors. So I think that is most challenging section I read from the Barth. And Barth transforms my perspective of understanding justice and grace. That grace does not eliminate judgment. So there is a judgment. There's evil things in the world, and God will get rid of those things. And then we believe the final judgment and but you cannot do it because our system is flawed. We cannot judge people. Human justice frequently becomes an exercise in scapegoating, identifying individuals to bear responsibility for broader systemic failures, then using their punishment to maintain the fiction that justice has been served. Divine justice reveals through Christ's identification with the judge, operates through radical inclusion, bringing even the condemned into the circle of God's love and redemption. The closer one draws to horror and the human failure, Barth suggests that the more radical grace becomes. So what should we do? And then what are the counsel implications? So we have to resist false binaries. Barth's prison experience led him to create the false binaries that structure systems of mass incarceration, like judge, cop, convict, felon, free, and then flatten those categories, and then we don't have to think deeply. And we just, if you make a mistake, put them in prison. out of sight, out of mind. But God, in His mercy, and Barth calls unconditional solidarity with prisoners precisely because they represent those whom society has decided to abandon, but it is precious to God. God's presence is more fully revealed among those who human systems have condemned, discarding. So, how do you talk to congregation? And then I think this is how I learned from Barth how to comfort them and also be with them. So first, we have to embrace complexity. Hold grace and accountability together without dismissing either. This means avoiding simplistic reactions that either condemning or minimize the situation. Either serve truth or that they don't really do anything for you. And you have to practice presence. So, it takes time. It's complicated. Emotions are high, and people are confused. And there are no easy answers. So the congregation needs space to process. And complex emotions and also conflicting realities allowing for grief, echo, and confusion. And also prioritize, and then we have to prioritize healing and reconciliation. This does not mean ignore harm or consequences, but rather creating a condition where genuine accountability and restoration become possible within the community. And I'm corresponding with my friend, prison. That makes it very challenging because I want to give him the parts, all the knowledge, dogmatic, tend to it, but and there's no internet access, right? So we can go to full seminary archive and then lower software and read it. No, it's no access. So I type a few things, right? Few quotation part and try to give him the encouragement. And then I gave him like 4 things because it's a lot to process. So I told him about the encounter Christ in the in prison. He's there with you. He's a pastor, but when he went there, he changed his mind. It's a different person. So theology does not really come to his heart, and he's very isolated. And then also I spoke about unconditional solidarity with God, and focus on I said the reconciliation accomplish the atonement, right? And then we talk about that, and we said I have to really embrace radical grace. The closer we draw to human failure, the more radical grace becomes. And I know this, but it's not easy because this is not cheap grace that ignores harm. It's costly grace that takes both sin and redemption seriously. And also, we have to think about how to observe God's life and God's sacrifice on the cross. And we talk about that. And then suddenly he began to change a little bit. He was already bound, but now he become some hope. And then he become bright, and then his email become a little bit brighter. But it's not done yet because he's worried about what if I come out? What's going to happen to him? How can I restore my life? He lost his license, and there's no way he can be passed away. Then what he wants to do, he have no idea. So we have to give some hope, and then prepare for the next step. And then, as I read Barth church dogmatics, I can reimagine what should our community should look like. Because church dogmatic, it's not systematic theology, but he saw something wrong with the church in his time, according to the loving Hitler, okay? loving Hitler and aligned with the government. So he was in crisis mode. Right? He really want to say something. Why should church behave? What should church do? Right? He said, "Oh, you have to proclaim the gospel." Of course. It's everything Jesus, okay? Right? But it's not Sunday school. But he nuanced, he agonized, and he wrote day and night. I don't know how he can write so much, right? I don't know. Is it human being or superhuman or multiple running around and writing together? I'm not sure. But Barth's understanding of church challenges each other. The church is not a community of the righteous, but a community of the judged who have experienced grace. This means that church should be the first community to understand that moral failure doesn't disqualify people from love, care, and eventual restoration. However, also grace also never eliminates accountability. The church becomes a community where people can confess failures, make amends, and work toward the restoration without being defined permanently by their worst actions. Can you imagine the church? We want to go to church, right? We bring the worst sins to God, accepted by Jesus and congregation, and then they are together with you for the journey of restoration. I think Barth had this in mind. Rather than choosing between condemnation and the minimization, the church can hold both grace and accountability, both support for families and acknowledging the harm done, both hope for restoration and recognition that some consequences are permanent, but grace of God is greater. So I like to conclude saying, where Christ stands. I talk about Barth, Christ's identification with the just and incarcerated people. Ministry in prison isn't peripheral charity work. It's central to God's work in the world. And God's overwhelming grace transforms judgment by integrating justice with mercy. And church is called to prophetic resistance against systems that dehumanize and abandon people. This requires both challenging punitive models, mindsets, and actively working for systemic reform. The question Dr. K's case poses isn't just about the one person's guilt or innocence. It's about what kind of people we choose to be in response to human failure and systemic brokenness. So I want to challenge you. Will you choose the comfortable distance of judgment or the costly proximity of grace? Will you maintain false binaries that protect your sense of righteousness or embrace the complex reality of human brokenness, divine mercy? Will you abandon those whom society has marked as dispensable, or stand where Christ stands, with the judged, offering radical hope for reconciliation and restoration? The incarcerated Christ is waiting for our answers.